This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Donald Trump's second presidency will probably bring an even stronger focus on Latin America than his first term did. On today's episode, we'll do a broad overview of the likely consequences for Latin America's economies, trading relationships, as well as the impact on domestic politics.
What people are seeing today in the region, in the election of Trump, and I'm talking about Latin America, is that the agenda, the Trump agenda, is reinvigorating the opposition to the current governments in places like Chile, like Colombia, like Brazil, where the left have been in power. And I think people are looking at Trump, people are looking at Milei, people are looking at Bukele and saying, oh, that agenda resonates with the voters. So what we're going to see is a more politically contested landscape in Latin America.
In recent years, we've often heard the lament that Washington does not pay enough attention to Latin America. Well, it seems that is about to change. President-elect Donald Trump talked about Latin America a lot in his campaign, mainly through the lens of immigration and the border, which were, without a doubt, key issues to his unexpectedly large victory. There are obvious implications for Mexico, but also for other countries throughout the region. During Trump's first term, much of the immigration to the United States was coming from Central America's Northern Triangle. But today, it's much more diverse, with big numbers from Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, Colombia, Ecuador, and more. Trade and the potential use of tariffs is also a big question mark, especially if some of these countries fail to give Trump the cooperation he wants on immigration. It's also true that Donald Trump will have quite a few allies in the region. Javier Milei in Argentina, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, as well as other conservatives, including Daniel Noboa of Ecuador and Santiago Peña of Paraguay, who will be eager to explore new partnerships and alliances. Add it all up, and Latin America may play a bigger role in Trump's second term than any U.S. administration in the past 30 years. Some will welcome the attention, others definitely will not. Either way, there's a lot to discuss. Our guest is Mauricio Cárdenas. Mauricio is professor of professional practice and director of the MPA in Global Leadership at Columbia University's SIPA School. Mauricio was also the former finance minister and energy minister of Colombia, the country, and he is a member of America's Quarterly's editorial board. Mauricio, welcome back to the AQ podcast, and let me start by asking you, do you agree that this administration will pay more attention to Latin America, and what do you think that means in practice?
Well, it's only 1 week into this new situation, and I think there is already kind of like a signaling that this administration will have significant effects for Latin America, more than I've seen before. I compare these with when the Biden administration began, when the Trump 1 administration began. Obama, the region is preparing for administration that'll have more impact. I don't know if it's good or bad, but that's going to be more.
Mauricio, I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a esteemed former finance minister with us and ask you about how a Trump economy may affect economies in Latin America. What are the risks? What are some of the opportunities, especially given the uncertainty over tariffs, what might happen to interest rates, and so on?
Look, at the surface, what most analysts are saying, investment banks in their reports, is, the U.S. is going to run a much larger fiscal deficit because Trump wants to cut taxes, and the higher fiscal deficit in the United States is going to cause high interest rates. As interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, the Federal Reserve is not going to be able to cut rates as much as it had predicted. And at the same time, with high interest rates in the United States, then the dollar will be stronger because people will put their money in the U.S. That's kind of like the standard answer. It's the conventional wisdom today. Let me say something that challenges a little bit that conventional wisdom, which is, yes, that's true. But at the same time, what people are seeing today in the region, in the election of Trump, and I'm talking about Latin America, is that the Trump agenda, is reinvigorating the opposition to the current governments in places like Chile, like Colombia, like Brazil, where the left have been in power. And I think people are looking at Trump, people are looking at Milei, people are looking at Bukele and saying, oh, that agenda resonates with the voters. So what we're going to see is a more politically contested landscape in Latin America. The announcement that President Trump made that he's going to bring into the administration this powerful couple, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, to create the Department of Government Efficiency. It's going to be emulated everywhere. It's going to be part of the language of politicians everywhere, especially in Latin America. Dismantle inefficient government agencies, reduce the size of the government. And I think that's going to be the dominating force now. I come back to the fiscal dimension. If that's going to happen, putting the fiscal house in order, it's going to be kind of like the dominant force. And maybe we're not going to see that world of high interest rates, etc., with negative consequences on the economy. If this agenda takes hold, this is going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for the economy of the United States to begin with, and it's going to be good for the economy of Latin America.
What do you think this means for Mexico? I mean, the USMCA trade agreement is one of the linchpins of the Latin American relationships with the United States. I mean, do you now look at Mexico and see doubt around the future of that arrangement? Do you think that we're going to get into a situation where the relationship is almost entirely defined by immigration?
Yeah, Mexico, I think it's in a critical position for two reasons. One is because everyone understands that the US-Mexico trade is crucial, and it's crucial for both countries. I mean, 26% of the US exports go to Mexico. So Mexico is a market, is a very important market. We also think, we generally think about Mexico as the source of imports in the United States and the main trading partner, et cetera, overpassing China. But Mexico is an important destination for US goods as well. So it's a trade relationship that is not kind of like one-sided. And two, the issue of migration. And the issue of migration is a top issue in Trump's language. And I think is one of the main reasons why he got elected. So I think at the end of the day, this is going to be mixed. I mean, when the new U.S. administration sits down with the Mexican government, they're going to mix all these topics. It's trade and it's migration. Trump was the creator of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal. Lighthizer, who's going to be, again, the U.S. trade representative, was the person who crafted that on the U.S. side. So they're not going to destroy it. They're going probably to review it. But it's the threat of that review to really get the conversation on migration and to ensure, and this is the critical aspect here, that Mexico does not play the role of kind of like serving as a bypass for Chinese exports getting into the U.S. market when they can get through Mexico with a lower tariff than if they go directly from China to the United States. I think that's the critical issue. I think that's what the U.S. government wants to stop. They don't want to see Chinese goods, marginally modified in Mexico with a little bit of added value in Mexico, but then getting into the U.S. free of tariffs.
Mauricio, whenever we talk about Trump and Mexico, I always try to start with a little bit of humility, I suppose, because so many of us got it wrong the first time, expecting a bellicose, hostile relationship between Donald Trump and Mexico, and especially when former President López Obrador was elected. This was not an irrational thing to believe. López Obrador wrote a book prior to his 2018 campaign that was called Oye Trump. And so, there was every reason to expect that there would be fireworks between those two. And of course, what we now know is that in the end, actually wasn't exactly a friendship, but a relationship of respect that was transactional. The two leaders figured out how to work with each other. A greater crisis was averted. USMCA was negotiated. And here we are, in large part because López Obrador somewhat unexpectedly agreed to play ball with the United States on immigration and move troops and accept the Remain in Mexico agreement and so on. So here we are now in 2024, and some expect that we could see a similarly benign story. As you've noted, there have already been some conversations between the new Sheinbaum government and people within the Trump administration. But there's this other side, which you've referenced in your comments so far, which is that, first of all, the Chinese presence in Mexico's supply chain is larger now than it was before. That would have been an issue in renegotiations for USMCA, even under a Harris administration, but it's definitely a red line for the Trump people. And then the migration issue, which is more severe for this government than it was when they took office the first time 8 years ago. The numbers are much bigger. And I wonder, Mauricio, and I'd like to hear you on this, are we underestimating the risk of some kind of rupture of USMCA this time around?
There are lots of uncertainties. There are lots of things we don't know. I mean, we don't know really much about Trump 2.0. I mean, Trump 2.0 could be a very different Trump. So you say, well, are we underestimating Trump in the sense that he's going to completely undermine the US-Mexico-Canada trade deal? No. I honestly think that his interest is not to basically destroy that. I think his agenda is China, China, China. So he's going to say to the Mexicans, look, let's make sure that what you sell to us is not just the product of first Chinese investment, point number one, or Chinese goods, that come through Mexico and get into the United States. The issue is China. And by the way, the issue is China in the general context of Latin America. I mean, we're moving from battleground states. That was, the election to battleground countries. I mean, battleground countries because China and the US basically are both seeking a dominant position in Latin America. And this is going to be the battleground of a lot of the, at least on the trade and investment side, wars between the United States and China. And many of the Latin American countries are going to become battleground countries. Peru is one example. Mexico is another example. So my sense is that they will not destroy the USMCA. They'll just try to fix that aspect.
Mauricio, I think it was right to start our conversation about Mexico or Mexico focused because we both agree that is going to be the main Latin America focus of this incoming government. But let's broaden the conversation now. You are, of course, Colombian, a former senior official in a previous Colombian government. What does this mean more broadly for the countries of South America? What does it mean for the governments that are left of center, like the Gustavo Petro government in Colombia? If you were in the current government, how would you be preparing for Trump to take office?
I think nowhere else in Latin America things are going to change more than in Colombia. To put it simply, I think during the Biden administration, there was neglect or almost indifference in the U.S. relative to what was happening here in Colombia. And part of that, I think, was deliberate. Colombia has the first leftist government in its history, and the U.S., rather than opposing and trying to make the life difficult for the Petro administration, basically decided to take a very passive attitude.
I heard from one Biden administration official that the strategy was essentially to wait out Petro.
Yeah. Indifference or, ignoring a little bit. He did not meet frequently with the U.S. government, with Biden himself. I mean, but the end result of that is that things in Colombia have gone in a direction that are not necessarily what Trump would like to see.
What are the things inside Colombia that you think will bother the Trump administration?
The one and most important aspect is the increase in cocaine production. I mean, cocaine production increased last year, 2023, by a staggering 53%. So this means it's not going to be an easy ride for the Petro administration. No one has asked Petro in Washington about this. Why did this happen? What are you doing? Why did you stop eradicating?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I know that the Biden administration officials did raise this, but to your point, it did not stop the trend from heading in this direction.
And not at a high level. I mean, you don't see kind of like the Secretary of State saying this publicly in a press conference. We're worried about Colombia. Maybe through the more, more silent and perhaps government to government channels, but it didn't become a major public issue. That's point number one. Point number two of the contestable issues is the spread of illicit or illegal groups, armed groups, all over Colombia's territory. So 2016, a peace agreement is signed. FARC, gave up their arms. Their control of the territory was reduced, and the country was kind of like heading in a direction of, reducing the intensity of the conflict. Petro comes and says, well, that was just very partial. We need to do a total peace. And a total peace means negotiations with all these groups that are illegal, including some that are not political, that are essentially drug traffickers, like the Clan del Golfo. And what they have done through these 2 years of negotiations is having, ceasefires in certain parts of the territory, either deliberately or because the military have been put on pause and they're not being engaged. They're back in their kind of like bases, not necessarily covering the territory. And that means that some of these very dangerous and threatening armed groups that are engaged in drug trafficking have expanded. Those two issues, I think, are going to be at the top of the Trump's administration agenda. And of course, the issue of Venezuela, but we can talk about Venezuela separately. But the fact that, Colombia was hesitant. Now Colombia has been saying that, yes, we want to see the results of the election, that they have to disclose the ballots. But really, Colombia has been on the side of the countries that have played the government of Colombia more in favor of Maduro than in favor of the opposition. That's for sure.
These issues that you mentioned, these problems within Colombia, serious challenges. What do you think the Trump administration might do, or what could they do in order to try to affect some kind of change? Because on the one hand, the days of Plan Colombia are over in many ways. You also have an administration that talks about non-intervention, that talks about being strategic with limited U.S. resources all over the world, including presumably in South America. How much influence will a Trump administration really have to affect the kind of change they want to see, especially with Gustavo Petro as president?
I can tell you what I think could end up happening. I think there'll be a warning. The Trump administration will say, well, you have to fix that problem, the drug production issue. You have to ensure that you generate the conditions so that cocaine production is reduced. And we leave it to you to implement the measures to achieve that. Else, you're going to face consequences. It's going to be a threat. It's not going to be something that is going to happen day one. The threat is there is a word that was used in the U.S.-Colombia bilateral relationship back in the day in the 1990s, late 1990s, which is desertification. So if Colombia is desertified because it's not doing enough in the war against drugs, then there'll be trade consequences. At that time, there was no free trade agreement between the U.S. and Colombia. There were some unilateral trade preferences, and the threat was to take those unilateral trade preferences out, which was something that worried a lot some of the Colombian exporters. So the word desertification is perhaps going to come back, and the language is going to be used. And now the threat is that there will be some reviewing or some adjustments or some increase in tariffs for Colombian goods. And I think that threat is going to move the needle here because the business community is also very keen in terms of preserving fluid access to the U.S. market. However, having said all of this, the Trump administration has to be very careful because Trump could trigger a response on the part of Petro, who is a populist, who has no problem in becoming even more radical to use Trump and those threats as a tool for effectively mobilizing support in Colombia in the streets and using Uncle Sam as an image of imperialism, as an image of the imbalances between the North and the South. So Petro can actually use that to strengthen his support here in Colombia, which is something that in the medium to long term is not going to be good for the relationship between the two countries. So that issue has to be there. He's not your regular Latin American president that will accommodate and will be passive with a more aggressive language coming from Washington.
Mauricio, I want to shift our focus to the country next door. You've mentioned already Venezuela. This is, of course, a complex issue. The Trump administration, the first time around, part of a coalition of countries that recognized an alternate government, that adopted a quote-unquote maximum pressure strategy that included sanctions, and also made comments suggesting that perhaps the option of U.S. military action in the country was on the table. Those policies did not work. Neither did the Biden administration's policies. We still have this dictator, Nicolas Maduro, firmly ensconced in power in Caracas. What do you expect Trump might try to do with regard to Venezuela a second time around? And critically, what mosaic of possibilities does he face given the current political map, not just in Colombia, but in Brazil and some of the other countries in the region?
I think this is the most relevant issue because at the end of the day, let's face it, nothing has worked. Of all the strategies that you just described, nothing has worked in terms of ending the Maduro regime. The only remaining option really is a negotiated solution. And it's hard to say it, but let's rule out the option of some military operation in Venezuela. I think that's not very much like the Trump style, and fortunately, that's very good that they don't plan to do an invasion. That's great. I'm very happy as a Latin American that those days are over. That's not how you change governments. So then the only option is a negotiated outcome, and the negotiated outcome has to imply some type of legal assurances to the Maduro regime in terms of ensuring that they can give up government without facing life in prison. And the only person in the world that can basically broker an agreement like that is Donald Trump. Is he willing to do it? I don't know. Is he willing to invest his time in fixing that problem? Certainly not in the first year. I mean, his plate is full with other bigger problems. Ukraine, the Middle East, the intensification of the trade war with China and the consequences that's going to have. So Venezuela is not a top issue in the agenda.
Mauricio, it's funny, when you started to talk about a negotiated settlement with Maduro, I thought you were going to go in a different direction, because I don't see any interest, unfortunately, on behalf of Maduro and his people to even start to have that conversation with anybody. And there's some speculation in Washington and in other places that perhaps there could be some sort of agreement between Trump administration and Maduro, where Maduro agrees to take Venezuelan immigrants back from the United States and perhaps is allowed to continue to send oil to the U.S., maybe even more oil than he does right now. I mean, that's obviously a very different kind of agreement from the one that you've just spoken about. But do you see that as a possibility?
Not really, because the two topics that you mentioned are not that feasible or relevant. Let me try to phrase this. I mean, oil production. Venezuela no longer plays an important role in the oil world. I mean, with production below 1 million barrels per day, maybe 900,000, 800,000, or even less, we don't know. It's not going to move the needle in terms of oil prices or in terms of providing more energy security in the world or in this hemisphere. So I don't think that's attractive enough to engage in a negotiation. It's like say, oh yeah, Venezuela is going to increase oil production and we're all going to be happy. No, I don't think the world needs Venezuela's oil now anymore. I mean, more than it produces now. It's not a big issue if they increase from 1 to 2 million barrels per day. And by the way, it's going to take 10 years to do that. So I don't think that really is a good motivation for a negotiation. And on the issue of migration, yes, there are many migrants, the Venezuelan migrants in the US, but they're now all over the place. I don't think it's going to be easy to, it will be impossible for the Venezuelan government, even if they wanted, to ensure that they go back to Venezuela. That would not happen. That would not happen. The only thing they can do is prevent people from leaving. And even then, it's a very hard thing, as you know, with the border with Colombia. So, no, I don't think that those two issues could actually be the motivations for a negotiation, a pragmatic negotiation between the Trump administration and the Maduro regime. So, we're coming to the conclusion indirectly in this conversation to kind of like a status quo. Status quo is perhaps the option that I think has the highest chance as we move forward, at least for a year or two.
Mauricio, let me shift gears again and ask you about China. This is an issue that sometimes in the Trump Latin America facing policy world, I think has been misunderstood. You've heard people say that, it's the socialist governments of Latin America, the Sao Paulo Forum, that are leading Latin American countries into the arms of Beijing. In practice, you and I both know that that's not really the case. The governments of all ideological stripes in Latin America have sought out Beijing as a trade and investment partner in recent years. Colombia is no exception. Some of the biggest proponents of engagement with China in recent years have been governments on the right. I'm talking about presidents like Iván Duque there in Colombia, Mauricio Macri in Argentina, Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador, recently even Javier Milei, after what he said against China during the campaign, has sought out a more pragmatic stance. We commonly hear that for the United States to be able to compete with China, that they have to offer something in return. I guess my question for you is, what would be effective on behalf of the Trump administration if they really are trying to, win these battleground countries, as you so wonderfully put it, really trying to seduce and cajole countries in the region to side more often with Washington than they do with Beijing? What would be effective?
The framing of the question kind of like implies that this is going to be transactional. Stop doing business with China and we'll give you this. Stop taking loans from China, we'll give you loans. Stop, hosting investment from China, it's going to come from the US. No, I don't think that's the language that's going to be used. First, because the US is in no capacity to offer something in exchange for what China is doing now. The US does not have huge state-owned enterprises that are going to invest in Latin America if Washington says so. The US, yes, has, banks, but indirectly. I mean, through the shares that the US has in the World Bank, in the Inter-American Development Bank, and that, has some influence on the way those banks are managed. It does have the Development Finance Corporation, which is a great tool, still to be used fully. It's a bank it's a US government lending and investment or entity, which could be used more, and they should use it. But I don't think that's going to be the conversation. I think the conversation is going to be more like, you're too engaged with China. This is the conversation, say, with Peru, which is about to inaugurate the Chancay port with big fanfare. Xi Jinping is going to be there. This is a huge port. It's going to increase port capacity in Peru. I mean, compare Chancay with El Callao. El Callao, the main port of Peru, this is like one half of El Callao. So it's a huge increase in the port capacity. And everyone in Peru is happy about that investment. It's going to increase exports of minerals. And it's essentially a port that will bring more dollars to Peru. So what the U.S. government say, but we're worried about that port. You're getting too engaged with China. And by the way, as the U.S. general that heads the Southern Command said, this can be used for military operations by the Chinese Navy. and it could be threatening to the U.S. security. I mean, that was a major statement. It went unnoticed, but she said that actually. So I think that the conversation is going to be more, how come you are getting so much investment from China and you don't say anything, and at the same time, you benefit from the free trade agreement with the United States, and a very important part of your exports go to the U.S. free of tariffs. You know, if you want to keep the U.S. market, make sure that you keep Chinese investment at bay, or at least you are also interested and engaged with U.S. investment. The ports in Peru that are owned by U.S. investors get the same treatment. And I think that's kind of like the type of conversation that's going to happen.
Mauricio, thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts during this critical week. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.